Good. How are you guys doing?
We're all good. Everyone is here. We're looking forward to the conversation. Thank you for making some time to join us today.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I'm dealing with a bit of a computer issues here, but I'm good to go now.
Hello, everybody. My name's Brian Berger. I'm the editor of SpaceNews, and we arranged today's webinar in order to discuss Intelsat's bankruptcy. They filed for Chapter 11 on May 13th. So we're going to discuss today, why now, what happens next. We have a great panel of veteran analysts with us today, and we also have a special unannounced guest to join us at the top of the hour to talk about the bankruptcy, and that is Samir Halawi, who is Intelsat's Chief Commercial Officer. And he's with us now. I want to make sure that Samir, can you hear us okay?
I can hear fine.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking some time. I know you're very busy this week. I guess I'd start off by asking you, Intelsat has been carrying a lot of debt for a while now. So why file for Chapter 11 this week? What's kind of driving the timing behind the filing?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, it's the legacy that is something that is no news to anybody. We carry about $15 billion worth of debt, and this was something that we have had to deal with, for a while. It was a burden on us, and it wasn't allowing us to invest in as much of the innovation and new things that we have wanted to over the years. What happened recently is that the FCC came out with an order, and it was designed in a way that for us to participate in the accelerated grooming of the C-band, we had to spend over $1 billion before we get any return on that investment. The potential that we're going after is about 4.8 billion of incentives for the accelerated clearing. But in order to do that, we had to spend a good $1 billion in advance. Now that necessitates that we increase our financial flexibility and our financial liquidity. We do have ample liquidity to run our business as usual, but in order to spend that extra $1 billion, we have had to increase our liquidity. So we decided that, after discussions with existing and new investors, we looked at multiple options, and we decided that this is the best course of action for us to do right now.
Thank you. Caleb, you're up.
Yeah. Now, Samir, you mentioned wanting to be able to invest in new technologies and saying that this debt was holding Intelsat back from doing that. Given all the focus on C-band, and I believe Intelsat has said you'll need up to 7 C-band satellites just to continue service while losing 300 megahertz of spectrum. Will Intelsat really be able to invest in next generation technologies like your successor fleet to the current Epic
Absolutely.
during this time, during bankruptcy?
Absolutely. So look, again, like I said, we had enough cash to sustain our operations and to continue in doing some of the investments that we wanted to do, including our next generation Epic satellites. With the $1 billion of extra financing that we just secured, we secured $1 billion of debt financing 2 days ago. That plus whatever we have on our balance sheet is going to be ample enough to cover the expenses for the FCC, and will also cover all the expenses that we have for our next generation Epic and our ongoing business, and for the ordinary course of operations.
Samir, will that DIP financing allow you to go ahead and conclude a contract? There's a lot of, I guess, speculation that Intelsat is Maxar's customer for the multi-satellite order that was just announced this week. Can you confirm that for us here today?
No, we're not confirming that at this point. We haven't disclosed anything on the contract for the satellites. But like I said, the DIP financing will be more than enough to cover for all the expenses that are needed for the clearing of the C-band. And the way it works is that the FCC is going to reimburse the actual cost of the clearing, but then in order to get the incentive for the accelerated payment of 4.8 billion, we have to incur a lot of costs in advance before we get any of that incentive. So we're moving very methodically along that plan.
Well, I also wanted to ask about the CARES Act and some of the activities that the Pentagon has been doing or discussing in order to help companies that the U.S. relies on from the consequences of the coronavirus and just the current economic situation in general.
Yeah.
We know that Intelsat situation is not, it preceded the coronavirus, but the coronavirus is mentioned in the bankruptcy filing. So does Intelsat hope or anticipate any sort of relief from the CARES Act or the Pentagon during this bankruptcy?
Sorry, I missed the last part of your question. Can you say that again?
I was just asking if Intelsat anticipates or hopes to receive any support from the CARES Act or from the Pentagon during this bankruptcy.
No, look, I think the CARES Act is very important for a lot of our customers that are struggling today. We serve a lot of customers in the cruise market and in the aero market. In fact, 75% of all commercial airplanes rely on us for their connectivity, and over 90% of the cruise services rely on us. Those guys are struggling, but they're getting support from the federal government to help them. We're working with them, obviously, to help support their business. In terms of the, I think what you were alluding to on the Pentagon side, it's really about, there are some other companies where there was concern that there's going to be a transfer of ownership to foreign hands, and that's not the case with us. We're not planning on transferring ownership to anybody right now. In particular, IGC is our government entity that provides services to the U.S. government that is outside of the Chapter 11 proceedings. It's not part of the Chapter 11 proceedings.
Okay, thank you. Brian, do you want to ask a question or two?
Sure. So at one point, Intelsat and SES were discussing possibly placing their C-band replacement satellite orders together. Is that something that's still on the table? Do you think it's going to happen, or should we expect Intelsat and SES to proceed separately in buying whatever satellites they need?
So look, I think the way the order that was drafted by the FCC, it was drafted in a way that really kind of disassociated the two companies, and we're doing things, we've been doing things separately. But you will hear more about the orders soon, once we're ready to make some news.
Sure. So you have, I think there's a May 29th deadline for letting the FCC know that you intend to go forward under the conditions of the accelerated payments.
Correct. And we do intend to go forward. We do intend to go forward. So we're going
intend to go forward.
We're going to be making the assessment that we do intend to go forward with the accelerated
All right.
process.
Sure. How long do you expect this Chapter 11 proceeding to take? How long or how soon could you potentially emerge from bankruptcy?
Look, it's difficult to say. I think we expect it will take probably 6 to 12 months. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly, to a smaller range or to exactly how long it will take. There's a lot of things to be done throughout that process, so we expect somewhere between 6 and 12 months.
What are the kind of big milestones looming on your calendar in terms of proceeding through this process?
Well, the big milestone is happening right now. It's the first day hearing. And so that there's a lot of motions that are being filed that will allow us to continue operating the business as usual, and to also move forward with our financing the way we have presented it. So we're looking forward to the end of this day. We put that behind. We keep moving with the business as planned, and we start signing contracts for the future.
Sure. Caleb, I'll hand to you.
Sure, I have a few more questions. And Samir, thank you for your time. I know you won't be able to stay with us for the whole webinar, but we appreciate you being here. Another question about the C-band satellites that are being ordered. I know some things have changed since this commitment was initially discussed, but in 2018, Intelsat, working with the C-band Alliance, said that all the satellites that would be procured to replace C-band spectrum would be ordered from American manufacturers. Is that still the plan for Intelsat?
Well, look, I mean, we've ordered so many satellites over the years from American manufacturers, so it's been kind of business as usual for us. It's not new for us, and that is the plan. Of course, when you look at procurements like this, you have to look at schedule availability and factory capability and timeline and all of that. But that's what we're looking for.
Samir, have you given any thought in recent days to whether if OneWeb and Intelsat had gone ahead with the merger, and that merger was going to erase something like $3.6 billion in debt? If that merger had proceeded, if you had erased that debt, do you think you would be entering Chapter 11 at this point?
You know, it's very hard to speculate and look backwards on this. You know, personally, to me, that merger made a lot of sense at the time. Mm-hmm. You know, different people looked at it in different ways. I think it would have been probably really good for OneWeb to have done that merger, because as you can see, the conditions for a LEO only are extremely challenging. You know, the offering of a LEO only is very difficult, but putting that together with a GEO makes a lot of sense when you have multi-orbit capability and a platform, an existing platform from which you have an existing revenue and an existing customer base to operate from. They didn't have that, so you know, things are the way they are. But I think if that combination could have been very interesting and very successful, and possibly, you know, from a financial point of view, very secure and very powerful.
So, you know, things have a way of happening in threes. So since the pandemic started, we've had the OneWeb bankruptcy filing, Speedcast, now Intelsat. I don't see these as related. The other two companies certainly suffered some deleterious effects of the pandemic, but I thought maybe you might want to address that. Do you see the pandemic as at all related to the timing of your filing?
Look, no. I mean, it has, obviously it had a little bit of an impact on us and on our business. Our business, you know, about maybe a bit more than 10% of our business in the mobility. It's growing. It's the one that is growing the fastest, but it's not the major part of our business yet. We have a more stable business in media and on the network side, on the government side. Those have largely not been affected by COVID. So, but because of COVID and because of some of the impact, it also requires us to really need the extra financial liquidity and financial flexibility. So it does play a role. It's not the number one factor. The FTC element is the more important factor. But I think it's important to draw a very strong distinction between us, OneWeb, and Speedcast. They're completely three different situations with three different objectives and three different outcomes. You know, for us as a company, we are very clear on what we're doing this process for. We're very clear in the direction that we're heading. Our business generates revenues today, and it's significant revenues. We're very relevant in a world, you know, where we are the largest provider of the U.S. government for SATCOM services. Like I said earlier, 75% of the commercial airlines rely on our services. 90% of the cruises. We serve 7 of the top 10 MNOs in the world. We serve over 2 billion people with TV services. That's like more than 6,400 TV channels. So we are extremely relevant in this world. We are the foundation architects of this business, and what we're trying to do here is a process to increase our financial position and our strength as a company. And we're confident that we're going to emerge much stronger than before, and with an ability to push more innovation. Speedcast is a service provider that had perhaps fundamentals that were a bit weak, because service providers have to patch up networks together from multiple operators and then resell them. And that's inefficient because they do so at economics that are not owner economics. And they're in a difficult position because they're squeezed in that layer in between. And if you look at all the service providers, a lot of them were struggling pre-COVID. Maybe COVID has accelerated this, but they were struggling pre-COVID. OneWeb is a different story. Like we said, it had a fundamental issue in terms of the business case and whether that makes sense for a LEO-only system that really has to get a return on investment very quickly, has to ramp up its revenues in an incredibly fast way because the life of their satellites is so short. And then they have capacity that is spread all over the world. They were intended for a certain reason, consumer broadband, that is not achievable with today's user terminal technology. And they have all kinds of limitations on the regulatory front. So when you look at all of this and the fact that they did not have revenues before, they actually have let go pretty much all their employees before filing. And, they declared that this is a difficult time in the history of the company. And then they did the filing, and now they're trying to monetize what they can from it. For us, actually, we have retained our employees, and we're not expecting any changes in the workforce whatsoever. Our business remains business as usual. We provide the same services for our customers, and we're just doing this to increase our financial strength as a company.
So you're expecting to avoid layoffs as you go through Chapter 11?
There's no layoffs that are planned. No changes in the workforce are planned.
Does any of the coronavirus relief legislation help you kind of fulfill that promise, or is that completely irrelevant to this?
It's irrelevant to us. We're doing this on our own.
All right, Caleb, I'll let you ask the final question, then we can let Samir go.
I can actually stay with you for a bit. I have a lot of things happening. I might have to drop at some point, but I can stay a bit longer.
Okay. Well, so we do have with us today some analysts who follow your company very closely.
Yeah.
And if you are going to stick around for a few minutes, I'd open it to the panel to see if you have any questions for Samir. You can let that know by either unmuting your mic or just give me a little signal I can see you all, besides Armand. Armand's gone dark.
I've got one. Oh, sorry to jump in there. Samir, when you left Thuraya, I think it was Thuraya, it was to join OneWeb. And I can't remember the exact role you had at OneWeb at the time. I want to say CEO, but it might have been CCO. I think it was CCO.
Correct.
And this was around the time of the SoftBank attempted debt exchange and then merger with OneWeb.
Right.
And then a short period after that, you moved over to Intelsat. It would just be interesting to hear what you learned at that time to drive that decision to go, well, I guess from Thuraya to OneWeb and then OneWeb to Intelsat.
So look, when I joined OneWeb, as absolutely like you said, the merger was happening, and actually it was the offer that I had was to join the combined entity as chief commercial officer of the combined entity. And that's what I was working towards. The merger was pretty much a done deal at the time. If you remember, it was just an administrative thing to get it done. No one expected that it would not go through, but it did not. And so I stayed for OneWeb a little bit, but I had the opportunity. Steve offered me the opportunity to move over to Intelsat, and I did that. Look, I have started my career in ICO, and you remember ICO, and I worked for an investment bank before ICO, and I was exposed to all the studies that were done that showed how the NGSO companies are going to make a killing, by doing this and that, Iridium, ICO, Global Star, and all of that. But their business plan was really flawed, and back in the late 90s, and not much has changed. I mean, the technology has improved, but we're still in a position where you take an investment and you want to spread it all around the world in a non-optimized way, and you have to ramp up your revenues very quickly. And unfortunately, although satellites are more powerful, you don't have the ground technology to match that. So it was difficult. It was a difficult proposition for a LEO-only operation.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Giles. Caleb, do you have another one? Nathan, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please. Samir, I think I want to just touch on one of the things you mentioned about investing in kind of the new next level of technology, software-defined satellites. So we will look at a market. Clearly, I think over the last years, you felt a lot of pressure in terms of the pricing, some of the traffic that migrated away. The Epic satellite has maybe offset some of the losses on the wide-beam satellite, but has maybe not fully be able to recover and offset at all. So what is then kind of the next evolution that would really kind of guard you with a more kind of stronger value proposition over the next 2-3 years, when there's, you know, device at 3, there's the constellations potentially looming that are all also partly addressing the mobility markets where you see a lot of the growth. So it's interesting to see how you think the new technology innovation would really make you kind of a differentiator compared to the increasing competition coming out in the next 2-3 years.
You know, look, I am not a big believer that it's technology that is going to differentiate you from your competitors. Eventually, everyone can acquire the same technology. And in the satellite world, you know, it seems like the last person that orders satellite has a bit of a competitive edge from a technology point of view over the other company. I think it's how you service your customers, and the service model and the business model is what differentiates companies, or what will differentiate companies in the future. From a technology point of view, we're very focused on the software-defined satellites because they're really flexible, and they also, I think one thing that OneWeb did really well was trigger a view of how to manufacture satellites that is more standardized, you know, and that is something that what we were missing as an industry for a long time. Everyone was doing their own thing, and that was really causing us to lose value. But by having standardized satellites that we, SES, Inmarsat, everybody orders, and we can configure those based on our use cases, our needs, our orbital slots, our customers, that is very powerful. You know, those new satellites are really flexible and are really capable. And I mean, their beams can even, you know, track planes as they go, and you can do so many different things with them. So the flexibility is there, and we can do that from GEO, where the economics and the fundamentals make sense. We believe that GEO makes a lot of sense. That flexibility and the fact that you can get into orbit in half the time than you were able to before is very important. And the advent of the mini satellites is also very useful, because those mini GEO satellites are able to cater to certain market needs without having to have, you know, too much capacity. And you have also timing flexibility with these. And you can also use them to kind of add to the density of the different layers that you have as a company. So we believe in the GEO capability of the future. We believe in the multi-layer within GEO capability. And what remains is the user terminals, you know, user terminal and antennas and all of that. That technology is evolving. There's a lot more alternatives and opportunities today, but we're still not at the point where we have a breakthrough on the user terminal where you can get really strong use cases like connected cars and consumer broadband, those use cases that require very cheap, very simple user terminals.
Yeah, but then if the technology starts to maybe standardize, so how can you make a difference then? Is that more, are you planning to go more like direct to the customer, like more managed services? Because again, if Inmarsat or, you know, it becomes, the technology layer becomes less of a differentiator, right?
Absolutely. Look, I think it's very clear that we have to go farther down the value chain than we've ever done before. And the customers are requiring this. I mean, the customers need us to do that. And you know, whether that service provider layer in between continues to exist or not, I think it will have a role to play. It might be a different role, and it will differ from one vertical to another. So in some verticals, we will probably be going direct. In other verticals, we will develop a distribution network that looks a bit different than what we had before. And what I mean by that is that we will probably be offering a lot more of the managed service, the package managed service, and the distribution becomes you know, distribution as opposed to service aggregation.
Okay, good.
Thanks very much, Nathan. Armand, do you want to take a crack at Samir while we have him?
Sure. Thanks a lot for joining us, Samir. A couple questions, but mostly related to how participating in the clearing process, how that might be impacted by the bankruptcy process that's going on. In other words, normally management can sort of decide to do what it wants to do. But once you enter into a bankruptcy process, you have the different creditors committees who can basically pose objections to the process. specifically, are the order of the satellites and participation in the accelerated clearing process part of the first day orders that are being heard right now?
Well, I think you should be listening to the order. Probably more interesting than listening to me. But
I've been to a few bankruptcy hearings. They're really not very interesting.
not very interesting. Yeah. Hey, listen. Look, I think it's you know, this FCC C-band process is really a really good deal. You know, it's in a way it's kind of a $5 billion deal. It's probably the biggest deal ever.
But a couple of your investors don't believe that and have been pretty vocal. And the bankruptcy process perhaps gives them an opportunity to object that they might not otherwise have.
So obviously we're working on the basis, and we've designed this in a way that we're fully intent on proceeding with this order. You know, we have made it clear to the FCC that we're going to be accepting the accelerated accelerated grooming process, and that's on the basis on which we're operating.
Okay, last question on a very different front. Now that we're a few years out, do you have a view on how successful the EPIC program was? It was originally intended to be sort of the engine of growth in the industry for Intelsat. That doesn't seem to have really happened. Do you have a view on whether maybe Intelsat should have been more aggressive with the design of EPIC to have more capacity, or, you know, sort of, he gives a little bit of a post-mortem on what happened?
Look, I think what helps a little bit is, like, I come from the MSS industry, and if you look, I think when I look at Intelsat, when I look at SES, I look at even Eutelsat to a certain extent, a lot of the FSS companies are transforming, becoming more like MSS companies, because they're going much farther down the value chain. MSS companies basically fulfilled the whole value chain, and when they offered whenever they had a new system, it was a kind of a full system, right? It was the satellite network, it was the ground network, it was the user terminals, it was the full service offering. You're selling gigabyte services to customers. And we're moving in that direction. I think with EPIC, what we probably have learned is that we could have, you know, the satellite system itself was perfect. It was exactly what we needed at that time. And today, those satellites are performing really well and are in high demand by our customers. I think one thing that we could have done a bit better that we're doing now for our next generation is having a full systems view, you know, including the ground network, including the user terminals, and including a package, a managed service all the way to the end user.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have a question? Just kind of give me the high sign and I'll call on you. Absent that, I do have a question about whether there's any expectations for further negotiations with the FCC about C-band, basically.
No, I don't expect that there's further negotiations. I mean, the order is final and it's clear, and it's you know, we're just executing on it now. We need to make sure that we execute on all the milestones for it.
Okay. I got some folks are asking questions via our Q&A feature. Questions like, what becomes of the common stock by virtue of the bankruptcy? Is that a question that you can address?
No, I mean, look, there's a normal process for this. There's going to be a negotiation, and then there will be a different capital structure at the end of this process. What it looks like exactly today, it's a bit unclear. But you know, it's not a surprise that the value of the stock is going to be different.
Could there be some exchange of the shares?
Possibly. You know, it's too early, I think, to tell.
Sure, I follow you on that. Another question is, why was IGC carved out of the bankruptcy?
Well, IGC didn't have any liabilities on it, or wasn't guaranteeing any of the liabilities, and there was no reason really to include it in the proceedings. I mean, we had some subsidiaries that were and others that were not. IGC was one of that was not. There was no point in doing that.
All right, thanks very much. I'm looking across the panel here. Caleb, do you?
Yeah, I have a few more if we have time for it. Samir, I'm curious how much of Intelsat's debt you hope to see wiped out as a result of this bankruptcy.
It's again, I think it's early to tell. Most likely over half the debt will probably be satisfied, but what is the amount exactly? I think it's too early to speculate.
Okay, and then one more for me, and then I'll pass the buck to someone else. You mentioned having an interest in paying more attention to the ground segment side with Intelsat's next generation services.
Yeah.
So Intelsat invested and partnered with Chimera at one point. But where else do you foresee future investments? Is this in more flat panel antenna technology, or is this elsewhere in the ground segment?
Look, it's not as, I mean, we have invested in Chimera, we've invested in some other small innovative companies as well. The point is that we need different types of antennas and terminals and ground networks for different use cases. And as you know, we cover pretty much the whole spectrum of customers, and they require different things. Flat panel antennas are very important for some markets, but not necessarily for others, where you don't want to trade off the efficiency for the form factor. So we have multiple investments that we have participated in, but we're also going to get more aggressive on the universal modems. This is a very important topic for us. You know, the lack of standards in the industry, the lack of harmonization have hurt the industry, and we're driving a consortium of other satellite operators as well to work on universal modems. And so it's not just the antenna, but also the modem, you know, that it can adapt to multiple different technologies, so that we can have the end user have access to basically all the satellite operators, no matter what is the infrastructure or the technology that the end user uses. You know, this should open things up and make the market size bigger than for all of us. That's our focus and our passion. And you know, we're trying also to, if you notice, we've done a lot of work on the 5G standards. So we're a member of ARIS, and we were driving the release 17 of that standard that brings satellite into the world of 5G, and that's very important for us. So the network should be quite hybrid in the future, and very seamless between the terrestrial world and the satellite world.
Thanks, Amir. So we have a lot of questions for our panelists as well. You are welcome to stay on the panel, so to speak, or we could let you go. But I do want to bring Caleb in to ask some of the questions that we have for the panelists joining us today, who I don't think we've actually taken the time to introduce. I imagine to a lot of our audience today, these are familiar names and faces. But Caleb, would you like to bring our panelists into the conversation at this point?
Sure, I think that'd be great. Everyone here is well-versed, all our panelists are well-versed in the satellite side. I think if anybody wants to give a brief introduction for themselves, I'll let them do that. I guess a question maybe just to start off for everyone on our panel. We talked about the timing of the bankruptcy with Samir. For the panel, was this a surprise to any of you that this bankruptcy happened and that it happened now?
If I kick off there, the surprise to me, so I don't think there was any surprise for anyone. I think anyone watching from even a reasonable distance could see that Intelsat's earnings trajectory was at complete odds with its capital structure. And that much has been obvious for, I guess, a couple of years now, before the C-band process kicked off. And I think the equity back then was priced for demise. I think that was priced for a restructuring, if you go back to the summer of 2017. And then there was the infamous submission to the notice of inquiry on the C-band, or expanded use of the mid-band as it was called back then, from Intel and Intelsat, that suddenly brought to life this entire spectrum arbitrage debate that essentially represented a huge fat get out of jail card for Intelsat. And then we all went on this very loud, noisy circus for, what was that, 2.5 years subsequent. But with, I guess, the combination of unfortunate events, which was namely an impeachment year and a very vocal John Kennedy out of Louisiana, you had a set of circumstances that led for a massive U-turn by the FCC and the wheels falling off that bandwagon. And that all happened in November. And I think in November, that was basically the death knell for Intelsat in its current incarnation. So no real surprise for me. Maybe the surprise is that it took 5 months. But that would be my response.
I have a slightly different take on it, not terribly different, but obviously Intelsat's debt cannot be serviced given its current business, right? And I agree with Giles that the C-band auction was intended to be a get out of jail free card. I think there was a little bit of hope that the $5 billion that Intelsat would be getting, plus some of the reimbursed costs, which will include replacing some satellites that would maybe have needed to be replaced anyway, might have been enough to keep them out of bankruptcy. But I think with the COVID crisis and the additional challenges we've seen the last couple of months in the industry, that hope went away pretty quickly. In terms of the timing right now, the bankruptcy can really do two things with respect to the participation in the FCC C-band clearing. One is if the decisions are part of the first day orders, there's a very limited time for anyone to object, and it can sort of solidify those decisions so that they can't be objected to later. It may actually make it easier for Intelsat to be committed fully through the process. On the other hand, if they're not part of the first day orders, there's a potential that participating in the process or even unwinding Intelsat's decision to participate in the process could get wrapped up in a whole series of court motions and could actually jeopardize the C-band process. So it could sort of go one of two ways. I think we're hearing from Samir that he's sort of suggesting it's the first, that it will actually facilitate Intelsat's participation. I assume that we'll get the results of the first day hearing probably later today. But we hope that's the direction that it's going.
Thanks, Armand.
Yeah, and I think, I think most is already well said by the other panelists, but overall, I think everybody in the industry know this is inevitable to happen. I mean, we've been having these kind of rumors discussions, I think, from dating a long time back already. And if you just look at, the economics in terms of, how revenue has been on a declining trend steadily, the level of the debt service that they had to carry every year. I mean, at one point it had to happen. So sure, all the C-band saga influenced much in the timing, but one way or another, this have to happen, I think, for the company to re-emerge in more healthy operational style.
Now, Giles, you had mentioned the influence of Senator John Kennedy. I wanted to come back to that because he had a reaction to Intelsat's bankruptcy news. His take was that because Intelsat went bankrupt, they should not get any of the $4.86 billion that the FCC put forward. And it's known that Kennedy is not particularly a fan of the whole FCC C-band process, of giving anything to any of the satellite operators that use C-band, because they all at least have some connection. They're either based or have strong connections to countries outside of the US. Do you think that Kennedy's stance now is a serious threat to the proceeds for Intelsat or any other, proceeds is probably the wrong word, but to the accelerated clearing payments and compensation to any of the satellite operators?
No, I don't think so. The caveat to my answer is that I'm obviously a Brit sitting in Britain, and I'm not going to have a detailed grasp of local politics and the machinations of Congress. But from what I can see from my outside looking in, his leverage has been deployed. His act of Congress, which is still sitting in a readership stage, hasn't progressed. I don't really know what his ability to intervene is at this point. And if you think, legally, financially, morally, and regulatorily, if that's such a word, there is still a 300 megahertz of the band to be cleared in an ecosystem that Intelsat controls and a customer base that Intelsat services. So Intelsat's, you can't just, this was the whole point about the C-band you can't clear the band without the acquiescence and the input of the satellite operators. So to make the argument that one of those operators, just because it had a bad LBO back in the 2000s and a bad IPO in 2013, shouldn't participate now, doesn't really hold water. It doesn't happen if that business goes into breakup or into liquidation. Equally, there's also a very strong argument, again, an argument that really drove forward the whole C-band trade right from that August 2017 submission to the notice of inquiry, which is the satellite operators need to be compensated, and need can mean many things in this particular context, but they need or should or deserve to be compensated for their opportunity cost. And again, I think that argument still holds even with Intelsat about to go through a restructuring. So again, with the caveat that I am a Brit observing local politics from overseas, I feel like this is a bit more grandstanding, and God knows that John Kennedy has been grandstanding in an election year. But maybe I'm just being too cynical.
No, Giles, I think that's a very good read, and I wouldn't apologize for your Britishness, at least not for that. I think you have a very good handle on the politics of it. But you know, Samir, while you're here, do you foresee this being a problem for Intelsat? This verbal opposition?
Look, I think we remain on point. This we believe that this proposal, when we made it and as it is today, is the fastest way to 5G in America. And it's highly beneficial to the country, and the economical benefits and the political benefits of having 5G as early as it would through this process is massively outweighs anything else. And so we're continuing with this. It was very important for us to, whatever we do, that we protect our customers and their viewers. That's highly important. And it's a lot of households and it's a lot of viewers that we have to serve. And through this process, we're going to be doing that.
Thank you, Samir.
I want to add one caveat to that. Is that there is speculation in some quarters that the amounts for the accelerated payments were sort of targeted to be something that would keep Intelsat out of bankruptcy just barely. That's sort of why you came up with that amount. I don't know if that's true or not. But if that were to be true, you could see potentially the FCC wanting to revisit the amount. Even if you cut it in half, it would still be a great deal for all of the operators. I don't know, but that's just a potential caveat, I think. But Giles's point that Kennedy has already used his leverage is true. It would probably take him to round up other politicians, particularly on the Republican side, to actually get something changed. It'd probably be an uphill battle. But I do think there is a possibility, but a pretty low one, that the amount might be revisited.
Samir, did you want to respond to that?
I don't know. I don't expect that it would. I mean, sure. It's called a final order, right? So.
Well, in the best of circumstances, it might be hard to kind of muster additional support for the positions that Senator Kennedy has taken. Right now, you could argue that the Senate and the House are only partially in session. And they have bigger fish to fry at the moment. Doesn't mean that they can't, walk and chew gum at the same time. I hope I'm not being too generous in my assessment there. But I'm wondering if folks think that the fact that there's so much else on the national plate at this point, that revisiting FCC seems unlikely.
I agree, it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, and Armand, I think, look, it's an incentive. So, to get something done sooner rather than later. And, it's in everybody's interest that this is done sooner, not later.
I mean, I don't expect you to admit it, but even if the amount were cut significantly, it would still be a good deal. But I do think you're right. It would be an uphill battle to change it. But I think it's a possibility out there.
Yeah. Thanks, Armand. Caleb, what else do we want to talk about here as we start to approach the end of the hour?
Yeah, I guess we're getting close. I did want to ask one of the audience questions. This is also to Samir. They ask, and I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, but will Intelsat be delisted as a result of this bankruptcy?
But I think we expect that there will be a customary, delisting of the stock. So this is likely to happen as part of what, a Chapter 11 proceeding. So that's probably expected.
What's the time frame for that? Is that something that would happen this summer, or does that come later in the process? I have to admit I'm not familiar.
I would expect soon. I think there's probably, I'm not an expert on this, but there's probably rules for the stock exchange that the stock exchange follows, in situations like this. So I would expect that this would happen sooner rather than later. Does
anybody on our panel have anything to offer in terms of what that means for ordinary shareholders? Does the stock just temporarily stop trading? Do folks lose their investment? Forgive my ignorance on this point, but
given that there's more debt than the company is worth, it's unlikely that current shareholders will be left with much. They may get a very small amount to make sure they don't object to a final disposition of the bankruptcy, but I think it's unlikely that they will be left with very much, if anything.
Is that a majority opinion among our panelists? Nods would be fine, or jumping in is okay.
Yeah, that's no. I mean, it's kind of, dare I say it, blindingly obvious. I'm sitting here wondering though what actually happens to the technicals around the share price. I don't actually know when the delisting happens. I don't have a feel for that.
Is the delisting driven by the share price falling too low, or is there something else that drives the delisting?
Well, presumably you have to notify the listing authority that you no longer want the shares listed, and at that point they're taken down.
I follow.
And undoubtedly there'll be some kind of set of rules around what you have to be a listed company. And I'm sure Intelsat is in the process of breaking those rules, so it might happen automatically. But as you can tell from my answer, I don't really know the details.
Yeah, there's rules around the share price being below a certain amount for a certain amount of time, and I don't know the details. There's also rules around the financials being delivered within a certain amount of time, and that's often broken in a bankruptcy process. So I agree with Giles that it's likely to be delisted at some point, either because Intelsat asks for it or because the bankruptcy process violates one or more of the listing rules.
Yeah. When you're out of compliance on the pricing, on pricing, you have opportunities to bring it back up, and you can kind of drag that process on for a while. And we've seen companies do that. It's sounding to me right now that we're talking about something different with Intelsat because of Armand, what you mentioned, that the company can actually request delisting. We won't hammer Samir on that too hard. That's a better question for the CFO. That's their job. Caleb, what else do we want to talk about here? Why we've got everybody?
Yeah, no, another audience question that I thought was worthwhile would be mainly directed towards our analysts. Someone asks, how will the high-profile bankruptcies of OneWeb and Intelsat impact investor interest in the space sector? And I would add Speedcast to that as well.
You want to pick somebody, or should we just draw a name out of the hat, or?
I'll pick on Nathan first, and then
Yeah. No, well, yeah, in terms of the investors, for sure, I think, it also, brings a sort of sentiment, I think, in the industry. And I think one of the biggest challenges we're right now having, if you look in particularly in the SATCOM industry, if you look at the revenues and the margins, they're all under pressure. So it has been, of course, aero and mobility has been kind of the promising segments where people see a lot of growth. The COVID-19 situation for sure put some near-term, let's say, questions about how that will return and when that will be the case. So I think overall it's something, the space industry and the SATCOM industry has seen a lot of investment. The returns for sure are not as the expectations that probably people would have set initially. So I think that's probably a sentiment, and as people need to prioritize their investments, would be something that that definitely impacts. Maybe also this could finally trigger a consolidation, right? In the industry, we've been talking about it for such a long time. If when Intelsat re-emerges out of this situation, would it offer some more opportunities for consolidation? I think one of the interesting points that maybe even want to see maybe with Samir or he thinks about it, this kind of broadcast network split that SCS was considering or alluding to, if he sees that something as potentially an option as well for Intelsat to free up cash, and he believes that the network division would be where the future is, or how he sees that. But I think overall, it has I think it will start to have an impact, and it will be interesting to see if finally this consolidation trend across the different levels around services and Satcom, vertical or horizontal, will now start to happen in the coming years.
I would, just in the interest of stimulating debate, I would actually characterize it very, very differently. I think people have been calling for consolidation in the sector because it's a knee-jerk response to anything ever going wrong. And when you ally that with the prevailing narrative around there's just constant price deflation, it's very easy to get into this bucket where everyone's saying, well, there's oversupply, everyone's missing their revenue expectations, there's price deflation, and you need to have consolidation. And actually, if you look at what went wrong, it was something completely different. Let's remember, one of those companies that went bust was not a satellite operator. It was a reseller, Speedcast. And Speedcast had benefited from structural price deflation from high throughput satellites for 5 years. PJ Baillier couldn't stop telling people how much his input pricing was coming down, and yet he still went bust. So the reason, I think the real reason that everything was going wrong was execution. It was never oversupply. It was getting planes, getting boats to start using this new technology. If you actually if you actually look at the map of high throughput satellites as they've been deployed, yeah, there's a lot of them, and we can all make a spreadsheet that adds up the capacity and compares it to the installed base and says, wow, that's a huge amount of supply coming, there must be oversupply. But if you look at the amount of high throughput over Hong Kong, or pick a place, the only place in the world that's got too much high throughput over it is really the United States. And that's because you've got the most mature in-flight connectivity market of any region in the world. If you look at Europe, not that much there, and you go to some places, it's like 1. This is why Inmarsat was winning hand over fist in-flight connectivity business in the Asia Pacific region, because Global GX was the only thing there. The issue this industry has had is not too much capacity or oversupply or price deflation, and therefore we need consolidation. It's because they did a terrible job of turning that investment into dollars of revenue. It took too long. Every customer took twice as long. And I would hope Samer would agree with a lot of this.
I 100% agree with you.
Yeah, we don't need consolidation because there's too many satellites.
Well, let me just to emphasize your point. You know, with the commercial era right now, commercial airlines looking to go into free Wi-Fi models. Obviously, before COVID, there was just not nearly enough supply around the world to satisfy what they need. That's for even one airline. You know, it's so it's not the oversupply. It's execution. It's the way we do things. You know, every company is so custom. Every technology is so custom made. There's no standards. There's no good user terminals. It's an execution issue.
Actually, maybe more basic than that. One of the other issues is just debt, right? Intelsat is in trouble because it has $15 billion of debt that was taken on when people thought the pricing would be stable. Speedcast is in bankruptcy because it also took on a lot of debt, made some acquisitions, and didn't get the synergies for the acquisitions to be able to pay down the debt. OneWeb is in bankruptcy for an entirely different reason, and that is they couldn't raise the money that they needed to complete the constellation.
Yeah, so the consolidation, this is why the Intelsat restructuring is exciting, because God damn it, what this sector has needed is a strong leader. And Intelsat was kind of the biggest and kind of the oldest, and could have been that leader, but it came to market with all sorts of problems. And so Intelsat restructuring, getting its house in order, fixing that capital structure problem and emerging in a year, 2 years time, 3 years time, I think is very exciting for this sector, but not because there's going to be a rationalization of pricing. It's because you're going to have a strong leader that can finally do the type of innovation needed to make satellite a relevant communications infrastructure in 50 years time. The industry, unfortunately, had a really easy first 50 years or first 40 years. Too easy. Everyone got lazy. And then those revenue streams matured, and innovation was required, and the industry did a good job of saying, right, we need some innovation, and came up with high throughput satellites. But because they spent the past 40 years having a conversation once every 10 years with Sky selling a transponder, and never really had to get into the mucky work of really selling hard, selling a new technology into a new application, they just, to use English vernacular, they really ballsed it up, and that was the issue. So Speedcast went under because, you know, the revenue didn't, because to Armand's point around their balance sheet, too much M&A, too much debt, and the revenue wasn't turning up in time.
Yeah, and the
so
innovation.
I look forward to Intelsat emerging. I hope it does really well. I think they're one of the best management teams. They played a very, very poor hand very, very, very well. And they deserved to have a win, but it didn't happen because of the political narrative around impeachment. And I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Samir, let's go to you. Samir?
Well, I could not agree more. I think, you know, those are really valid comments, but, you know, the innovation is not just in technology, but it's in the business model and how you serve your customer. I think this was missing, and you're absolutely right. You know, this has been a complacent industry for too long, and we hope to change that.
So if I heard Giles correctly, you see Intelsat, by virtue of emerging from bankruptcy, would be well positioned to be the leader that this industry needs. If I heard that correctly, why Intelsat as opposed to SES or Eutelsat or somebody else?
Well, look, it could be one of any of these guys. Look, this sector has seen a huge amount of market cap drain out of it because it has, to repeat, consistently screwed up, ballsed up on the execution of this new type, you know, monetizing this new type of technology. But at the same time, they can kind of stand proud and stand up and say, I told you so about LEO. OneWeb has gone to the dogs. LeoSat's gone to the dogs. Phasor has just gone to the dogs. You know, this whole LEO science project is turning out to be exactly what I just said. And what the incumbents said it was always going to be, a science project. So I think the incumbents, the Eutelsats, the Intelsats, the SESs, can stand up and say, in spite of their terrible share price performance and Intelsat going bust, they can stand up and say, with credibility, having a 40 or 50 year heritage of turning a megahertz of geostationary KU band spectrum into $1 of revenue counts for something. It counts for something. Now, if Intelsat can get its house in order, and if, you know, SES can get $3.9 billion in from the C-band situation, and if they can functionally separate the video business and put it together with Eutelsat's video business, and if we can get some sensible balance sheets backed by some sensible strategic action, then this industry is set to finally be perceived to be a good industry again.
I think I'll give you a
it plays in some of the most exciting applications in the world. The best application in the world is mobile broadband. It's the best. It's the most price elastic, and it's the highest growing. And yet satellite has walked into it like a drunk guy off the street who, I don't know, I'm coming up with very bad analogies, but, you know, for me as an observer, and I hope everyone here can identify, it's been very exciting, lots of false dawns, but mostly disappointment. But we can
Speaking of drunk guys, last call for questions or comments from any of our panelists. Armand, you seemed like you were champing at the bit.
Yeah, a quick comment here. I think the question was why might Intelsat be the leader going forward after this? And I think the answer might be that change is hard, right? We all agree that the industry has been lazy and needs to learn how to do the very nitty-gritty, difficult things that are required to satisfy customers. The bankruptcy process, though, gives a company an opportunity to have real experts who are sitting in all the different credit committees to go through the company and suggest changes and to really make the difficult changes, and in fact, force the difficult changes on a company that it would be difficult to make otherwise. So this is an incredible opportunity for Intelsat to really change the culture, get the people, get the other things done that it needs to go down the value chain and do the things that Samir is talking about. The other companies in the industry essentially aren't feeling that kind of pain. They don't have credit committees sitting down their back pointing out places where they might be able to economize, like Intelsat will have over the next several months. So this is a really opportunity to sort of make a shift in the company's culture and approach, if done correctly.
Thank you, Armand. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I think we've had a very lively discussion, a very interesting discussion. This is not the end of this topic. This is really just the beginning of the topic. I think we heard a lot of indication of where we continue this conversation as the summer proceeds. A lot of questions remain about where LEO is going to fit into this ecosystem. We heard quite a bit of skepticism about that. I'd be very interested in kind of reconvening a panel to dig into that a little further. Samar, I wish you the best of luck with the Intelsat Onward campaign. It sounds like you have some support from the analysts here that the future could indeed be bright for Intelsat when it unburdens itself of its debt load. To the audience, thank you very much. A bit of housekeeping here. This will be available as a replay recording. I think pretty much almost immediately. We've been live streaming to YouTube, so that should be available just as soon as they kind of churn it through their servers. And we'll have it on our website. I can't really think of anything else other than to thank all of our panelists. Caleb, do you have any final words about today's event?
I do not. I just want to also thank all our panelists for participating. Samir, thank you for joining us. It's a great last-minute addition. And
that was very interesting. Thank you.
Appreciate everyone's perspectives. I think we've got at least 3 or 4 countries here. We've got the US, the UK, Canada. Yeah, so I think that's 3 of us. So it's just good to have everybody together.
And we have even more global representation once you look at everybody who's joined us from around the world as the audience. So thanks a lot. Thanks again, everybody. Hope to see you back for our next webinar. With that, we bid you farewell. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.